Gaywyck by Vincent Verga. Publisher Allison Books, Los Angeles, New York. Narrator Eric Aust. Chapter 2. It occurs to me that at crucial moments, alternate routes seem to exist. Light provokes illusion. By rejecting Harvard and all it represented, I thought to remain unplumbed by embracing the hermetic world of Gaywyck. I hoped to stow away my heart uncharted and unknown. Seemingly to avoid self-revelation, I pursued life as though a mirror reflected, mistaking left for right and back for front. Fleeing from my demons, I arrived in their midst, forced to do battle. I achieved victory over the dark in the depths of the cave of the heart. I remember little of the journey from Rochester to Hoboken. I know I was strained and overtired. I had not slept the night before. My excitement and fears kept me pacing my room. When the sun rose, I walked through the woods that surround our house. The pace of the late September dawn calmed me. I felt a momentary contentment recalling Father Howard's description of my destination. Gaywyck, a great, secluded mansion in the classical style on the southern shore of Long Island, surrounded by dense woods on three sides, the fourth exposed to the sea. Never having seen the ocean, I was exhilarated by the ideal of living within hailing distance, of being summoned by its pounding surf as familiarly as I was now by this day's dawn. When I cleared the trees, I glimpsed my father's pale face in his study window. He appeared to be crying, ashamed. I glanced away. I looked again. He was gone. The window pane seemed wet in the sun's reflecting light. I sighed, relieved. I felt too fragile to face another confrontation. I hurried to my room to finish packing and to dress in my best gray broadcloth suit. According to my journal, the train left Rochester at 10 a.m., arriving in Hoboken at 3 p.m. The weather upstate was cool and bright clear. Father Howard drove me to the station in Miss Grammond's carriage. My father and I parted at the door without any show of affection or grief. Instead of the bustling world of Harvard and the law as he had planned, I was heading for a deserted estate on Long Island and the position of librarian to one Danough Gaylord. I respected his disappointment. I wished he could have respected my right to choose my own life. I waved goodbye. Once on the train, as the tints of autumn slid by, I was stunned by a sadness too deep to sustain without tears. It was as if the seat had collapsed, dropping me through my life with not a soul to break the fall. I saw my scowling father standing rigid in the doorway, his hands by his side. I saw my absent mother's ghost, a weeping Madonna, framed in the window. I heard Father Howard officiously repeating instructions as if he were intoning some arcane litany of exorcism. Opening the book, lunch packed by Miss Grammond, searching for a napkin to wipe my face, I found a note wound around a $5 bill. Dear Robert, such an important day. Be brave and strong, Robert. You who are so dear to me, do great things for me. All my love. Angela Grammond. The comfort in those simple, perfect words. I looked through my own reflection and smiled with my complicitous self. It grew warmer as we chugged south, and the conductor suggested we open the windows. I spent the journey reading David Copperfield, eating. Miss Grammond had packed food for 3, gazing at the scenery and picking grit out of my eyes. By the time we reached Hoboken and I stepped off the train, the force of the heat slapped me giddy. I was to be met at the depot by Mr. Martin Head. I walked a few feet down the platform, and then stopped in panic when a porter overtook me. I had no idea where he came from, but the trunk he juggled was mine. He extended his free hand to take my Gladstone. I surrendered it, convinced I'd never see either again. I studied his face. A description might be required at a later time. Bravely, I resumed walking. Reaching the end of the platform, I positioned myself directly outside the gate and waited, heart pounding, for Mr. Head. The terminal was vast, every inch of it crammed with scurrying people. The porter disappeared into the crowd before I could shout after him. A very tall, very thin, red-headed man approached me. He was short of breath and perspiring heavily. He introduced himself as Mr. Martin Head. He put himself at my service, totally bewildered by the heat and the crush, relieved beyond speech by his having discovered me in the throng. I nodded meekly, muttering, Yes, thank you," and fell into step beside him. My trunk in Gladstone? Been collected. Ferry over here. Is it always this hot in September? Stinking Indian summer. Don't know why it's blamed on them. We walked across the station through a long wall of doors, down a gargantuan ramp where Mr. Head gave a uniformed man some coins, and across a cool dock to the waiting, churning ferry. I've never been on a boat before, Mr. Head. She ain't much of one. That doesn't matter, I thought. He conscientiously maneuvered us into a position that guaranteed a view of the skyline. Enormous birds flapped and squawked overhead. I wanted to ask their names, but my guide was perspiring heavily and seemed submerged in some personal misery. I kept as still as I could. The changing look of Manhattan Island was familiar to me from the dramatic pictures I'd studied in the pages of Harper's Weekly, but as it loomed into view, my jaw dropped. I never knew I had a passion for the gigantic until that skyline awakened it. I wanted to know now all about the great lives that sustained the mythic place, and especially about the greatest of saviors, Danough Gaylord, who held dominion over my life. I saw his city bright with imperial glitter, his streets walled, man-made canyons, sailing across the calm river toward his seemingly silent fortress, awash in gleaming daylight. I felt storybook wonder. Atlantis and Nineveh! With a surge of joy, I felt all my lost illusions restored. He would make everything well. He would grant my one wish, peaceful, never-ending solitude. Had I but known. At Pier 43, my Mr. Head delivered me to the short, elegantly dressed, elderly Mr. Edmund Goodwin, who wore gray spats with pearl buttons. Before I could thank Mr. Head properly, my second courier spun on his heel, exclaimed, "We're late," and moved in the direction of the street, alarmed. I followed, waving to a pale Mr. Head, who smiled and said something I did not hear for the noise. I think he wished me well. I could not have used anything more. The pier and its surrounding area was so unpleasant, so foul-smelling, so god-awful hot, so crowded, so rotten to the eye and nose, with garbage strewn underfoot, with crates stacked precariously everywhere, with vendors hawking fruits, vegetables, umbrellas, clothes, newspapers, animals at the curb. A clutch of filthy, tattered urchins screamed and danced in front of a stately ebony brougham drawn by a pair of the most perfectly black stallions I had ever seen. Buffeted, I was embraced and engulfed by the tremendous activity around me. I was lost. I felt sick. Where was Mr. Goodwin? I noticed again the splendor of the equipage, and for the first time the ornately scrolled letter G embossed in gold on the door above my reflected, panic-distorted face. The door opened. My image slid off its shiny surface like a glazed bun off a tilted plate. Mr. Goodwin beckoned me with a wagging index finger from inside the carriage. I slipped around the other side, he said. I stepped up and found myself enveloped in a cocoon of the most gorgeous gray velvet. Gently closing the door, he rapped twice on the wall behind him, setting the jewel box of a coach in motion. He never lifted the shades. My first impression of the streets of New York were based solely on sound and smell and a few yards of sidewalk in front of Pier 43. Outside, the din lessened slightly as we pulled away from the pier, but what I assumed to be the ordinary sounds of the city were most disconcerting. I felt hounded by the thunder of construction, threatened by what seemed an irate mob, and pursued by enraged horses, kneeing and stomping on all sides. But the most appalling noise was the howl and clangor of the municipal transit systems, cable cars. The enchanted labyrinth was inhabited by monsters. Mr. Goodwin spoke twice. The first time, he identified the horrifying roar passing overhead as the 6th Avenue elevated train. From Harper's, I was able to fit an image to the pandemonium. I nodded knowingly while smiling gratefully. The second time he announced we were at our destination. How he knew is beyond me. The carriage had stopped so many times, only to start moving again with a gut-wrenching jolt. He descended, offering much-needed assistance. I was as shaken and wobbly as if I had been to sea in a rickety tub, rather than riding for 30 minutes in high style through the streets of the world's greatest metropolis. For the first few moments, I swayed on the sidewalk in the glaring heat. Hordes of strangers bustled by, smiling at me and gaping enviously at my carriage and pair. As I catalogued my impressions, I gathered this piece of the island was far removed from Pier 43. It was relatively quiet, immaculately clean. There were no street vendors, and the people looked as if they'd leaped from the pages of Godey's. I took a deep breath and glanced at what rose before me. St. Patrick's Cathedral on 5th Avenue between 50th and 51st Streets in the mid-afternoon sunlight. I was unprepared for the immediate impressions it made on my dazzled senses. The gleaming white Victorian Gothic structure looked like a huge cake. An elderly, portly cleric interrupted my thoughts, such as they were, by introducing himself as Father William Collins of St. Paul's on something or other street, just off 5th. He repeated his name. I stared blankly. Leaning toward me, he whispered gently, "Yes, it does overwhelm one with its majesty. Greater than Chartres, much greater. So fine. Take your time, my son. Collect yourself. I do understand. So fine." I looked into his large blue eyes. Such a dear man, I thought. I also remembered who he was, which was more to the point. Father Howard had said his name at least 20 times in as many minutes. He most courteously dismissed Mr. Goodwin. "You've succeeded beautifully, so beautifully," who returned to the carriage at the curb. The priest and I stood silent for several minutes among the parade passing on the sidewalk. He seemed lost in meditation. I studied the New Yorkers, noticing the trim cut of the man's suits, and felt as if I were wearing a flour sack. Then, turning to my father, Collins informed me that he thought me calm enough to enter the cathedral, to confront its magnificence. "Live the experience, my son, as I know you will. Father Howard wrote me of your sensitive, gentle soul. Being pensive myself, I do understand." He winked conspiratorially. Taking my arm, he slowly led me up the steps, guided me into the cool, gaping mouth of the edifice. Devoured by a cake, I thought. Curiouser and curiouser. Father William Collins obviously loved St. Patrick's Cathedral and What I was doing there was a mystery soon solved. He told me in a mellow whisper as we moved down the central aisle that he had convinced Mr. Gaylord of the necessity of my seeing this great monument to Christ and to St. Patrick during my brief sojourn, in the hopes it would inspire a rebirth of faith, rekindle the divine light. The matter was, of course, just between me, Father Howard himself, and God, since Gaylord had not been told of my waning fervor. Not his concern, my son, though he is concerned about everything in your sad history. So sad. Your mother is in my prayers, rest assured. The mention of her made my heart race. I looked away when he asked if I didn't see an iridescent quality in the window tracery. I smiled politely, not having the heart to contradict the sweet old man. What relief when I trudged out into the open air and stood on the cathedral steps again. The balm of the bright, hot sunshine. Father Collins checked his watch and announced the time approaching for 12. My interview with my employer was scheduled for 6:30. Father suggested dinner before the ride down to the Gaylord townhouse at number 15 Gramercy Park, on the corner of Irving Place. He gestured toward an empty black Victoria at the curb. As we neared it, I spotted the same scrolled gold letter G that had adorned the previous carriage. Like that other vehicle, it was of rare finish and proportion, appointed in the same gray velvet upholstery. Black stallions, twins to the other pair, clopped the pavement, anxious to carry me further toward my destination. Mr. Danough thought an open carriage would be acceptable from here to number 15, Father Collins explained as we climbed aboard, with a stop for dinner at Child's on 42nd Street, which was my suggestion. The ride down Fifth Avenue was tremendously exhilarating. Such a variety of traffic, such hustle and bustle, so many beautiful people. All the pictures in the world can't capture the fervor of it. The city pulsates, and all the while my companion chatted delightfully about the glories of the town, pointing out those buildings he could identify by owner or occupant, most of whom were members of the 400 or attended his church. At the corner of 42nd Street and 5th Avenue, the carriage stopped without signaling. We descended while Father spoke with the driver. I looked about me, people of all shapes, sizes, and colors, yet with touching similarities. Overheated and fatigued, thronged the streets. They wore the most astonishing varieties of costume. Some looked dressed for the stage, and others looked as if they'd only just arrived from foreign lands. They all seemed absorbed in private thoughts and impervious to everything, and all in a frantic hurry. What's the big rush? They're hungry. Been working all day. Probably all going to Child's. Across the street on the southwest corner, an immense excavation yawned. It was the widest, deepest man-made hole line I'd ever seen. A large sign identified it as the proposed 42nd Street branch of the New York Public Library. Like me, I thought, a vacant space soon to be occupied by a splendid building and books. We walked to Child's along 42nd Street amidst thousands of souls, speeding in various directions. The restaurant was a sparkling, clean establishment, all tile and marble, with an endless number of tables. Between the tables, 10-foot standing fans churned the air above our heads. The waitresses wore white blouses, pert black bow ties, and full white aprons. It was a noisy place, but, to me, inviting and exciting. We sat at one of the round tables, joining 4 other gentlemen. Never having been in a restaurant before, I was relieved when he recommended the regular dinner. Such a bargain at 15 cents, Robert. My veal was delicious, and Kathleen, our waitress, after promising to visit St. Paul's that coming Sunday, gave me a second order of fried potatoes on the house. I ate heartily, though silently, feeling comfortable with my companions, who soon were engaged in congenial conversation. I was thinking of the ride down Fifth Avenue and imagining Danough Gaylord. After dinner, we found the hansom waiting outside. 45 minutes remained before my appointment. The driver was instructed to go slowly down Fifth Avenue, then across 23rd Street, so we might see Madison Square Park, then down 4th Avenue to 20th Street. In the carriage, I found a thin gray blanket of the softest cashmere for our laps. When we spread the blanket to avoid the evening damp, a woven, scrolled letter G embraced my knees like some great spider. We rode for several blocks until I summoned the courage to ask, "Have you known the Gaylord family for a very long time?" His mood changed completely. All traces of joviality disappeared. "I have been the family's spiritual advisor for decades. I baptized Mr. Danough, and to my eternal sorrow, I buried his mother, his father, and his twin brother, Carmack. They are a remarkable family. Remarkable." He began relating his version of the Gaylord family history. I sat enthralled, oblivious to all else. Gay Mysteries audiobooks. I think it is easy to hate a label, but a face humanizes the word. So this effort is twofold: to offer comfort to those like myself that your world didn't end because you don't fit into the view of acceptable society on both sides, and in hopes of helping those with family that are LGBTQ, that it doesn't mean we are aliens from the child they once knew. Reassure them so they can maybe be supportive at the same time, being true to their values.